What if humanity's oldest written words were never meant to tell us how everything began, but to warn us how it ends? What if what we call the first civilization wasn't first at all, but the last survivors of something far older, out in the burning deserts of southern Iraq, where the horizon shimmers like a mirage that hasn't decided if it's real yet? Broken pieces of clay still whisper. They lie half buried in the dust, stamped with tiny wedge-shaped marks made by hands that turned to bone 5,000 years ago. And yet, somehow, those marks still hum with intent, as if the clay is trying to hold on to more than just words. It's trying to hold on to memory. Hey, before we go any deeper into the ruins, if you're into this kind of in-between space between myth and archaeology, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely love this stuff. And if you're still with me right now, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I like imagining this story traveling through time zones. Some of you walking to work, some on a late-night drive, some of you drifting off to sleep with headphones in, while a story older than history itself plays in the dark. Our story doesn't start with answers. It starts with dust. In the late 19th century, archaeologists dug into the mounds of ancient cities near Uruk and Eridu. At first, they expected to find the clumsy beginnings of civilization. Rough huts, crude tools, awkward attempts at writing. The sort of hesitant first steps you'd expect from humanity just figuring things out. But when they started pulling tablets from the earth, that's not what they found. Instead of primitive scratches, they uncovered fully formed writing systems. Instead of chaotic villages, they found planned cities. Instead of guesswork, they found mathematics, law codes, star charts. The civilization we now call Sumer didn't shuffle onto the stage of history. It walked on like it had been rehearsing somewhere else. The earliest Sumerian cities, Eridu, Ur, and Nippur, weren't messy camps that slowly evolved into cities. They were geometric, carefully laid out, aligned with the stars. Their streets followed grids. Their canals were engineered for irrigation in a way that still puzzles modern researchers. Even their language arrived like completed download. Sumerian has no known parent language. It's a linguistic isolate, meaning it doesn't clearly connect to any other language family we know. It shows up in the archaeological record fully formed, already capable of expressing law codes, medical text hymns, and astronomical observations. It's as if someone carried it in from somewhere else and just dropped it complete on the Mesopotamian plain. History, as we like to imagine it, prefers a slow ramp. Stone to copper, copper to bronze, one tool leading to the next. But Sumer breaks that rhythm. Its precision suggests memory, not invention. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Scholars have been wrestling with this for over a century. How does the first civilization show up already knowing how to use base 60 mathematics, still baked into our clocks and circles today? Map the heavens with eerie accuracy. Build large cities with complex administration and legal systems. Align temples and structures with celestial events. Where's the messy trial and error? Where are the half-finished ideas? The deeper archaeologists dug, the stranger it got, because the Sumerians themselves left an explanation, and it's one that doesn't sit nicely with our modern worldview. On some tablets, they wrote that kingship, knowledge, and order descended from heaven. They didn't claim they invented civilization. They said they were restoring something that had existed before. On one small clay cylinder in a museum in Berlin, there's a simple line that changes everything. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, not creation, not experiment. Restoration. If Sumer was rebuilding, then what exactly had been lost? And how much of that earlier world did they still remember? Imagine holding one of those tablets in your hand. The clay's cold now, but once it was soft and warm, shaped by someone who lived before Rome, before Egypt's Great Pyramids, before pretty much every empire we've heard of. Sometimes, if you look closely at those tablets, you can still see fingerprints pressed into the surface. The smudge of a scribe who lived 6,000 years ago. A literal human touch, frozen in baked mud. And then another thought hits you. What if those hands weren't just recording daily business? What if they were writing down the final fragments of an age that had already ended? The last echoes of a world erased by flood, by time, or by choice. Because these tablets aren't just shopping lists. Among the receipts and rations and taxes, there are texts on medicine, astronomy, complex mathematics, and hymns to gods whose names most of us have never heard spoken aloud. One tablet from the poor records a 584-day cycle of Venus, something modern science only confirmed with precise instruments. Another lays out the paths of Jupiter and Mars. Some contain mathematical formulas that show up more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras ever walked the earth. And it's not just the writing. The artifacts themselves tell the same unsettling story. Bronze tools show up before the region is supposed to have Bronze Age technology. Cylinder seals, tiny carved rollers used to stamp images into clay, sometimes depict what looks suspiciously like mechanical devices. And then there's the odd little object we call the Baghdad battery. A clay jar, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod. Put an acidic liquid inside it, and you get a weak electric current. 2,000 years before anyone was supposed to understand electricity at all. Coincidence? A random experiment? Or another echo of older knowledge surviving in a world that shouldn't quite have it yet? But the artifacts whisper, the stories shout. The Sumerians spoke of a great flood that ended an earlier age. A world reset. A civilization drowned. And that same story, with different names and details, appears everywhere. In Akkadian texts, in the Hebrew Bible, in Hindu epics, in Greek myths, in Mesoamerican codices. Cultures separated by oceans and mountains, by thousands of years and completely different traditions, all remembering a catastrophic flood. So how do you get the same story appearing in places that, as far as we know, had no contact with each other? Maybe stories, like silt in a river, drift and settle wherever human consciousness flows. Maybe people are more connected, even in deep time, than we're comfortable admitting. Or maybe, and this is where some researchers quietly raise an eyebrow, maybe those different cultures weren't telling separate myths at all. Maybe they were all preserving local versions of the same global memory. When archaeologists finally uncovered the ruins of Uruk, they weren't staring at a primitive town. They found city walls stretching roughly 6 miles, monumental temples, structures aligned to celestial points. And buried beneath one ziggurat, a massive step temple, there were over 40,000 clay tablets. A civilization obsessively documenting itself, and yet somehow leaving us with more questions than answers. How did they learn so much so quickly? Where did their base 60 system come from? The same logic still hiding in every clock and every compass. Why do their star maps look less like people discovering the sky for the first time and more like people remembering it? Some scholars try to smooth the story out. Maybe Sumer rose from earlier, smaller settlements that just haven't survived erosion or flooding. Maybe we're missing a long, slow build-up because the evidence was washed away. It's possible. Others suggest that the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from an older culture, one wiped out at the end of the last ice age, when sea levels surged and coastlines drowned. And then there are the more daring interpretations, the ones that read the tablets literally. When the Sumerians wrote that kingship descended from heaven, maybe they weren't being poetic. Maybe they were describing teachers, whether gods, travelers from distant lands, or remnants of an earlier, advanced human civilization that stepped in after catastrophe to help rebuild. Even the skeptics, though, have to admit, the timeline is weird. Civilizations aren't supposed to pop into existence fully structured. You don't usually get writing, mathematics, law, astronomy, music, architecture, and medicine all maturing at the same time, right at the start. But that's exactly what the Sumerian record shows. The tablets don't read like the messy notebook of a civilization figuring things out. They read like a backup drive being restored, as if what we call the birth of civilization was, for them, just the latest attempt to reconstruct a world they'd already lost. If Sumer was restoring something, not inventing it, then the clues shouldn't just be in their stories. They should be baked into the bricks of their cities, into the very way they built their world. And when you look closely, that's exactly what you see. Think about how a first civilization is supposed to look. A bunch of huts clustered around a water source, winding, improvised paths. No zoning, no large projects because nobody's really done this before. That is not what you find in the earliest Sumerian cities. Take Eridu. On the surface, it's just a dusty mound in southern Iraq. But when archaeologists cut into it, they didn't find a single settlement getting slowly more advanced over time. They found layers. Temple built on top of temple, one after the other, stretching back thousands of years. At the deepest levels, you'd expect crude experiments. Someone's first attempt at a shrine. Crooked walls, random orientations. Instead, the oldest structures are already sophisticated. They're aligned with the cardinal directions. They sit on raised platforms that appear to have been placed specifically to capture certain celestial sightlines. They're surrounded by channels and basins that look suspiciously like an engineered water system, not just, hey, the river is over there. It's as if whoever founded Eridu already knew what a sacred city was supposed to look like, as if they were following a template. UR tells the same story. Most people recognize UR because of its famous ziggurat, a massive step platform dedicated to the moon god Nana. But zoom in on the city itself, and you start noticing the pattern. Streets laid out in surprisingly regular grids. Thick defensive walls reinforced with bitumen and fired brick. Materials that require advanced kills and a good grasp of chemistry. Houses with interior courtyards open to the sky, arranged at deliberate ratios instead of random sizes. Drainage systems built into homes and streets, quietly doing their job for 1,000 years before modern plumbing. Even the placement of doorways and corridors seems to echo astronomical orientations. It's like the builders weren't just designing a place to live. They were trying to map the heavens onto the ground. Then there's Nippur, the spiritual heart of Sumer. It wasn't the biggest or the richest city, but it was the one that mattered for legitimacy. To rule without Nippur's blessing was basically political suicide. When researchers mapped the distances between major Sumerian cities, they noticed something odd. The spacing seemed to fall into patterns, ratios that mirrored the same base, 60 mathematics the Sumerians used in their tablets. It's as if the cities themselves were placed like notes in a song. Intervals, harmonies, a landscape composed rather than just settled. This doesn't feel like improvisation. It feels like memory. Architectural muscle memory. And all of this is wrapped in a language that behaves like it came from nowhere. Sumerian, as we mentioned, is a linguistic isolate. That basically means we can't find its cousins. Every other major ancient tongue, Akkadian, Hebrew, Sanskrit, Greek, Egyptian, fits into some kind of family tree. You can look at how they change over time, track the sound shifts, watch how words evolve. But Sumerian steps onto the stage already wearing a full costume, speaking in complete sentences, quoting poetry and writing law codes. There's no obvious Proto-Sumerian underneath, no rougher, simpler ancestor language we've uncovered. Linguists have tried to connect it to all the usual suspects. Indo-European? No. Semitic? Doesn't line up. Dravidian? Uralic? Basque? Nothing fits cleanly. It's like trying to plug a strange puzzle piece into every slot and realizing it doesn't belong to the set at all. And the script they use, cuneiform, is just as strange. Each sign could stand for a sound, a word, or even an entire idea, depending on context. That's like using the same shape in our writing system to mean cat, K, or living thing, depending on where you put it. It's not the kind of system you expect at the beginning of literacy. You'd expect something simple first, maybe pictures, then symbols. Cuneiform looks like something that evolved from generations of experimentation. Except we don't really see that evolution. We just see Sumer stepping in with this already complex hybrid of sound and meaning. The Sumerians themselves said their writing was a gift from a goddess named Saba, she who counts the stars. To them, writing and counting and watching the heavens were all part of the same job. And when you look at the content of their tablets, you start to understand why they saw it that way. Some of the earliest texts we found aren't myths at all. They're technical, dry, almost boring, until you realize how impossible they're supposed to be. There are tablets that precisely track the synodic cycle of Venus, 584 days, matching modern measurements. Others chart the motions of Jupiter and Saturn with such accuracy that modern astronomers had to double-check them with computers. You don't get that just by casually glancing at the night sky for a few years. That kind of data usually need centuries of continuous observation and a really good system for handing that knowledge off from generation to generation. Civilizations are supposed to work their way up to that, but Sumer opens with it. Then there's the mathematics. The Sumerians use a base 60 numeric system, sexagesimal. It sounds exotic until you remember we still use it for 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Base 60 is actually better than base 10 for certain things, because 60 has so many divisors. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. It's incredibly convenient for fractions, astronomy, and geometry, but it's also not intuitive. You don't just stumble into it. You have to abstract your thinking and then commit to it across your entire culture. Later on, in the old Babylonian period, scribes, intellectual descendants of the Sumerians, wrote a tablet we now call Plimpton 322. For a long time, it looked like a mysterious list of numbers. Then mathematicians realized it's full of what we call Pythagorean triples, sets of numbers that satisfy A superscript 2 plus B superscript 2 equals C superscript 2. That's over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. And the tablet isn't explaining the theorem. It's using it as if the geometry behind it was already well understood. We see square roots, quadratic equations, compound interest problems. The kind of math we associate with much later civilizations show up early and casually, like they're tools from an older toolbox no one bothered to label because everyone already knew how to use them. And once again, it's not just the ideas. The physical objects back it up. Sumerian bronze doesn't look like, oops, too much tin, let's try again next century. It appears in a record already well balanced, already using efficient copper-tin ratios that metallurgists praise today. We find medical tablets that read like early clinical notes, lists of symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments using dozens of plant-based compounds and procedures. There are incantations, yes, but also systematic observation, cause and effect, organized data. And threading through all of this is bureaucracy. Lots of it. Sumer is full of records, tax receipts, property deeds, worker payrolls, temple inventories, ration lists. This is the kind of administration you expect after centuries of state development. But Sumer is doing it at the supposed dawn of complex society. So you start to notice a pattern. Everywhere we expect slow, messy beginnings, we instead find refinement. Systems already in place. Knowledge already structured. Cities laid out with intention. Language and math and astronomy behaving less like newborns and more like survivors. Even the dirt seems to agree. In some sites, like Uruk and Eridu, the deeper archaeologists dig, the more refined the structures become. You'd expect the opposite, basic at the bottom, sophisticated at the top. Instead, it can feel like watching a civilization in reverse, like you're peeling away younger, simpler attempts to expose an older, cleaner pattern underneath. And throughout all of this, the Sumerians keep repeating a single idea. Kingship descended from heaven. Knowledge came down. Order came down. They saw themselves not as inventors, but as caretakers of something they'd inherited, something that had almost been lost. In other words, the clay doesn't look like it's documenting the rise of civilization. It looks like it's documenting a restart. Among all these thousands of tablets, rations and hymns and laws and formulas, there's one document that pushes this idea to its absolute limit. It's a simple list written in the same wedge-shaped script used for grain tallies and tax records. But what it claims breaks history in half. It's called the Sumerian King List. Among all the tablets Sumer left behind, receipts, hymns, legal codes, medical notes, one clay document stands in a category of its own, not because it's beautifully decorated or unusually large, but because of what it calmly insists is true. It's known today as the Sumerian King List. And on the surface, it sounds pretty straightforward, a record of who ruled where and for how long. The kind of thing you'd expect from a civilization that loved its paperwork. But once you actually read it, things get weird, fast. The tablet opens with a single line that feels like it's humming with something too big to fit inside it. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu, not kingship was invented. Not people started organizing themselves. No, kingship came down. What follows is a list of rulers and cities, but the first section reads like a chronicle from another universe. It describes 8 kings who ruled before a great flood, and their reigns aren't measured in years the way we'd recognize them. They're measured in tens of thousands of years. One king, Alulum of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alauger, reigns for 36,000. Others follow, Enmenluana, with 43,200 years. Names tied to real cities: Eridu, Bad Tibura, Larik, Sapar, Shurapak, each accompanied by a reign length that breaks your brain a little. Add them all up, and those 8 pre-flood kings rule for a total of 241,200 years. Then the text drops a single devastating sentence. Then the flood swept over. Just like that. No drama. No metaphor. No explanation. One line cuts reality in half. After flood, the tone doesn't change. The style doesn't change. The king list just keeps going. More kings, more cities. But now their reigns shrink. Hundreds of years. Then tens. Eventually, lifespans that sound recognizably human. It's as if the document is saying, before the flood, the world worked one way. After the flood, it worked another. Here's what makes it even stranger. The king list is not written like a myth. It doesn't read like a sacred hymn or a cosmic poem. It's presented with the same dry, bureaucratic precision as a tax record. Names, cities, numbers, next. And the cities it mentions? A lot of them are real places that archaeologists have actually dug up. Eridu, Shurapak, Kish, Uruk. These aren't fantasy locations from some mythological nowhere. They're physical sites with ruins, pottery, architecture, and very human history. So you end up with 3 uncomfortable facts sitting side by side. The king list treats pre-flood and post-flood rulers in the same tone, as if both are history. Many of the cities it mentions are real places we've excavated. The reign lengths before the flood are absolutely impossible by any normal human standard. So what do you do with that? The usual response is to wave it away. Okay, clearly these are exaggerated ages. They're trying to make their ancient kings sound divine. It's mythology folded into a political document. Or, scribes mess up the numbers over centuries of copying. Errors crept in. No big deal. But here's the thing. These numbers aren't random. The pre-flood reign lengths in the king list tend to be neat multiples of 3,600. An important Sumerian unit called a sar. In their system, a sar wasn't just some big number. It was linked to celestial cycles, to the turning of the heavens. Alulum's 28,800 years, that's 8 sars. Alauger's 36,000, 10 sars. Enmenluana's 43,200, 12 sars. You see the pattern. 8, 10, 12, tidy multiples. It's as if the ages of these kings aren't ages at all, but encoded periods, astronomical cycles dressed up as lifespans. If that's the case, then the pre-flood segment of the king list might not be trying to tell us. Here's how long these guys lived. It might be saying, here are the eras they represent. Here are the cosmic epochs they govern. In that reading, those 8 antediluvian kings become less like individual politicians and more like guardians of ages. Rulers of vast spans of time measured not by birthdays, but by planetary alignments, by the slow turning of the sky. Kingship descending from heaven might not be a poetic flourish at all. It might be describing a system where rule is tied directly to the heavens, to cycles, to stars, to something we probably call astronomical timing. But that only shifts the mystery. Because if your royal chronology is secretly a star map, why wrap in the language of kings and cities at all? Why encode cosmic data into a government document? Unless, for the Sumerians, there was never really a separation. Time, kingship, and celestial motion were all part of the same woven reality. To rule justly was to rule in alignment with the heavens. To fall out of sync with that order was to invite chaos, disaster, maybe even flood. And that line, then the flood swept over, starts to feel less like a mythological punchline and more like a fault line in time. The Sumerians weren't shy about elaborating when they wanted to. They could spin big dramatic stories about gods and wars and love affairs. But here, when they come to the single event that resets their entire timeline, they give it one sentence. No adjectives, no scene setting, just then the flood. It almost reads like a trauma statement, a point beyond which words don't really help. And yet, they keep copying it, over centuries. In different cities, Nippur, Larsa, Ashur, scribes sit at their desks, pressing the same names and the same impossible numbers into clay again and again, preserving a record they clearly considered important. They could have fixed it, rounded the reins down, made them sound reasonable, edited the cosmically weird parts to fit a more believable story. But they didn't. To them, changing the numbers would not have been making the text more realistic. It would have been an act of forgetting. Because from the Sumerian point of view, the king list wasn't just a timeline. It was a memory device, a way of saying, this is what we were, this is what we came from, this is what the flood took away. When you hold that idea in your mind, that to them, memory itself was sacred, you start to see the king list differently. What if the pre-flood kings really did exist, but not in the way we imagine kings today? What if they represented lineages, institutions, or even knowledge systems that lasted for ages, tied to the slow rhythms of the sky? What if 241,200 years isn't a literal stopwatch, but measure how far back their memory reached? How many cycles of cosmic time they believe separated them from the original world? And what if the flood was not just a story of divine anger, but a real event or series of events that broke that continuity, that erased not only cities and people, but also the context needed to understand the code? Because right after the king list drops that single line about the flood, everything changes. Lifespans shrink. Kingship moves from city to city. Reigns become mortal length. It's as if the universe itself has switched modes. The age of godlike rulers tied to celestial cycles ends. The age of human kings begins. From the Sumerian perspective, that wasn't just a shift in politics. It was a downgrade in reality. To us, the long reigns sound absurd, and the shorter ones sound normal. To them, the long reigns were the standard, the old, proper way things were. What came after, the brief, fragile rule of mortal kings, was a symptom of loss. The flood didn't wipe out fairy tales. It wiped out memory. And everything that followed, every city, every ziggurat, every tablet painstakingly pressed with wedge marks, was an attempt to rebuild not just infrastructure, but remembrance itself. The king list is what you get when a culture refuses to let that memory die, even when it no longer fully understands what the numbers mean. Which brings us to another layer, this time a literal one. Because if a real cataclysm separated the before and after of Sumerian history, you'd expect to see it not just in clay, but in the ground. And when archaeologists started digging deeper into the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, they found exactly that. When archaeologists dug down into the deeper levels of ancient Sumerian cities, they expected to see what you normally see in old settlements, a slow stack of history. One culture layered gently on top of another. Broken pots, ash, bones, walls, life destruction, rebuilding over and over. But that's not what they found. Instead of smooth continuity, they hit a blank, a clean band of nothing. In the 1920s, an excavation team led by Sir Leonard Woolley was digging at the ancient city of Ur. They cut a deep trench through layers of houses, temples, and streets, and then suddenly, their tools stopped hitting anything made by human hands. No bricks, no pottery, no ash or bone, just clay, thick water-laid clay. They kept digging, down, through about 8 feet of the sterile, uniform material. Only after they passed through that did they hit more ruins, burned walls, shattered pottery, and the remains of an older settlement beneath. Woolley stood there in that trench, surrounded on all sides by this strange, lifeless layer, and realized what he was looking at. He was standing on the line between two worlds. Below the clay, a city that ended violently in fire. Above the clay, a rebuilt city rising in the aftermath. Between them, a thick deposit of flood silt. Water had come, hard, and Ur wasn't the only place that told this story. At Shurapak, the very city the Sumerians associated with their flood hero, Ziggurats. Archaeologists found the same kind of sterile layer. Human occupation, then a break, then earlier ruins below. At Kish, another important early city, the pattern appeared again. This wasn't just normal river flooding, the kind you get every year that deposits a thin film of silt on the fields. This was something bigger. A sudden, violent inundation that washed away almost every trace of human life in certain layers, then eventually receded, leaving behind a thick, dead band of clay. The dates weren't exact, they never are, but many of these big flood layers landed somewhere around 2900 BCE. That's roughly in the neighborhood of when the Sumerian tradition places the flood. Now, does that prove a single global deluge that covered the entire planet? No. Archaeology doesn't hand out answers that clean, but it does tell us this. Something happened. Something big enough to wipe out entire cities. Something big enough that later generations would remember it not just as that bad year with the water, but as the dividing line, a before and after for civilization itself. And that's exactly how the Sumerians wrote about it. In their texts, the flood isn't narrated like a campfire story. It's handled with chilling simplicity. Then the flood swept over. One line, clean, final. The oldest known version of their flood story comes from a tablet found in Nippur, written in Sumerian, older than the Hebrew Genesis, older than the familiar tale of Noah and his ark. In it, the storm rages for 7 days and 7 nights. The huge boat, as the tablet calls it, is tossed on waters that have swallowed the world. The man at the center of the story is named Ziggurats, he of long days, or life of long days. In Akkadian versions, he becomes Utnapishtim. In Hebrew tradition, Noah, different names, same skeleton of a story. The structure repeats again and again across cultures. A man is warned of an approaching flood. He is told to build a vessel. He brings aboard the seed of all living things. The waters rise and destroy the world. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Birds are released to test if dry land has returned. A sacrifice is made after survival. The survivor is granted a special fate, often long life or immortality. In the Sumerian telling, the warning comes from Enki, the god of wisdom, and the keeper of the me, those divine blueprints of civilization. The other gods, led by Enlil, have decided humanity is too noisy, too chaotic. The balance of the world is off. The decision is made, wipe the board clean. But Enki can't accept that, not because he's particularly sentimental about humans, but because he cannot bear to see knowledge destroyed. So he cheats. He doesn't directly tell Ziggurats, "Hey, I'm breaking the divine agreement here." Instead, he whispers to the wall of a reed hut or speaks through a dream, depending on the version. So technically he's not addressing the man, he's addressing the wall. Loopholes. He tells Ziggurats to abandon his possessions, to focus on life. Build a boat. Seal it with bitumen. Bring aboard animals. Yes, but also craftsmen, musicians, scribes, the carriers of memory, the human embodiments of the me. Abandon riches and seek life. The text says, despise property and preserve the soul alive. The flood comes. The tablet describes wind and water, so fierce that even the gods are afraid. The great boat is tossed across a featureless sea where cities, fields, and temples have vanished beneath the churning dark. Then, just as suddenly, silence. When the waters finally recede, Ziggurats opens a hatch. He sends out a dove. It comes back. He sends a swallow. It returns as well. Finally, he releases a raven. The raven doesn't come back. It's found land. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Ziggurats offers a sacrifice. The gods, who had just tried to wipe out the world, smell the smoke and gather, suddenly aware of what they've almost done. Enlil is furious that someone survived his judgment, but Enki argues that wisdom shouldn't die with the wicked. The compromise? Ziggurats is granted immortality and sent to a place at the mouth of the rivers, a kind of liminal zone at the edge of the world. He becomes a living memory, a permanent witness to the age that died. And this is where archaeology taps us on the shoulder again. Because if this story were pure allegory, we might expect the physical evidence to say, nah, nothing like that ever happened. But the dirt doesn't quite cooperate. Across Mesopotamia, Those thick flood deposits mark a sudden destructive event, or perhaps several large floods that clearly disrupted human life on a massive scale. Zoom out further. Core samples pulled from the Black Sea show that around 7,500 years ago, rising meltwater from retreating ice sheets broke through natural land barriers. When that happened, Mediterranean water rushed in and transformed a lower freshwater basin into a much larger saltwater sea in a relatively short time. For people living on those old shorelines, it would have felt like the ocean invading the land. Go back even farther. At the end of the last ice age, between about 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, the planet didn't gently warm up like a slow sunrise. It lurched. Climate snapped back and forth. Glacial lakes burst their natural dams. Sea levels rose over 400 feet. Entire coastlines where humans had probably been living for thousands of years simply disappeared. If you were part of a culture living on those coastlines, organized, knowledgeable, perhaps even advanced in ways we don't fully grasp, you'd see your entire world erased by water. You'd flee inland. You'd carry seeds, tools, sacred objects, and stories. Always stories. Your grandchildren and great-grandchildren wouldn't remember the old cities directly, but they'd remember that the world used to be bigger, that the sea used to be farther away, that once, long ago, there was a flood that erased everything. That kind of trauma doesn't stay local. It becomes the backbone of your worldview. So when you look around the world and find flood myths everywhere, in Mesopotamia, in the Bible, in India, in Greece, in China, in Mesoamerica, you have to ask, did all these cultures invent the same motif by coincidence? Or are they all holding on to fractured memories of real events, filtered through different gods, different languages, different landscapes, but echoing the same core experience? Maybe it wasn't one single planet-wide tsunami. Maybe it was waves of regional catastrophes triggered by the same global changes from the end of the Ice Age. But for the people living them, it wouldn't matter. Their world ended. The Sumerians were very clear on this point. The flood didn't just wipe out bad behavior or punish sinners. It erased an entire order. It drowned the age of pre-flood kings. It ended the era when knowledge, kingship, and law flowed down from heaven. It closed a chapter on the world where the divine and the human were intertwined. What came after was smaller, more fragile, mortal. The survivors didn't just rebuild houses. They rebuilt memory. They carved star charts into clay. They wrote down king lists that stretched back into impossibility. They preserved stories of Ziggurats and his boat, and the god who couldn't let knowledge die, because to them, the flood wasn't just a disaster. It was the reason civilization had to be restored instead of invented. And according to their tablets, after the waters fell and survivors stepped out onto a changed earth, they weren't alone. Teachers came. The Sumerians had a name for them. They called them the Anunnaki. After the silence came the teachers. That's how the Sumerian tablets framed the world after the flood. The old age had ended. The giant of time, the pre-flood kings, were gone. The connection between heaven and earth had thinned. Humanity stood in a landscape scraped clean, and then, according to them, something, or someone, returned. They called them the Anunnaki. The name carries weight even thousands of years later. In Sumerian, it means something like those who from heaven to earth came, or the princely offspring of Anu, depending on how you translate it. Either way, the idea is the same. They weren't from here. What sets the Anunnaki apart from the kinds of gods were used from later mythologies is how specific the Sumerians are about them. These weren't vague, distant beings who lived in some abstract spiritual realm. They had cities, roles, responsibilities, personalities, family drama. They worked, argued, plotted, taught. They show up in the tablets almost like historical figures. Just plus something. Enki is the one who stands out first. He's a god of deep waters, wisdom, and the keeper of the me, those mysterious divine codes that govern everything from kingship and music to metalworking and justice. He's the one who warns Ziggurats about the flood, the one who, according to the text, just couldn't let knowledge drown. Enki's city was Eridu, the oldest of the Sumerian sacred sites. Archaeologically, Eridu really is one of the earliest cities in Mesopotamia, with temple foundations stacking back thousands of years. The myths say that's where Enki lived among humans, teaching them irrigation, agriculture, healing, and crafts. His symbol? The serpent, not as a villain, but as an emblem of wisdom, renewal, and secret knowledge. That's a symbol that'll appear in a lot of other cultures too. Then there's Enlil, where Enki is the clever engineer and quiet rebel. Enlil is the executive force of the cosmos, god of air and storms, the one who signs off on kingship and law, the one who, in most stories, actually approved the flood. His city was Nippur, the spiritual center of Sumer. To rule without Enlil was to rule illegitimately. Every king who mattered claimed his blessing. His temple was described as a navel of the world, the point where heaven and earth were joined. Above them all was Anu, the god of the highest heavens. We don't see him descend into story as often. He's more like the cosmic background authority. His name shows up in star charts and temple names. He represents the idea that the sky isn't just decoration. It's structure, law, order. Around these three, a full cast. Ninhursag, the mother goddess who shapes life from clay. Inanna, goddess of love, war, and strange journeys between realms. Utu, the sun god who brings justice and illumination. On the surface, this sounds like mythology, as in stories ancient people told to make sense of the world. But the Sumerians don't describe the Anunnaki like vague archetypes. They record their actions with administrative precision. They list their temples. They tie them to specific cities and genealogies. They write about their interactions with humans in the same matter-of-fact tone they use to record grain shipments. And then there's a story that makes a lot of modern readers sit up a little straighter. The creation of humanity. In the text known as the Atrahasis epic, the gods are tired. They've been doing the heavy lifting. Literally, digging canals, building cities, maintaining the cosmic infrastructure. They complain. They revolt. There's a divine labor dispute. The solution? Create a new kind of being to take over the work. Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag are tasked with the project. The tablets say they take clay from the earth and mix it with something else, the blood of God who is sacrificed for this purpose. From the flesh of the god, the text says, "Let a spirit remain. Let it proclaim him as a living sign." They mix divine essence with earth, shape it, and from that blend, humanity is born, part dust, part God, mortal bodies, but carrying inside them a fragment of the divine. To an ancient audience, this is a powerful spiritual metaphor. To a modern audience who's heard even a little about DNA, gene splicing, and engineered organisms, the language feels uncomfortably technical. Mixing essences, transferring spirit, creating life by combining something from above with raw material from below. In the 1970s, a researcher named Zecharia Sitchin took this idea and ran with it. He proposed that the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth, needed labor, and genetically engineered humans as workers. In his view, clay plus divine blood is really a poetic description of genetic manipulation, editing an existing hominid species into us. Mainstream scholars overwhelmingly reject Sitchin's interpretation. They argue that the evidence doesn't support literal alien visitation. The Anunnaki, they say, are not astronauts in disguise. They're mythological projections, personified forces of nature or ancient ancestors elevated into the realm of legend. And that's a fair criticism. There's nothing in a Sumerian tablet that says, by the way, they came from planet X in a metal ship. But even if you strip away the alien angle completely, something remains stubborn. The Sumerians did not think they invented civilization. They thought it was given to them. Again and again, the tablets say, writing was given by Nasaba. Kingship descended from heaven. The me were kept by the gods and then handed to humanity. In one myth, Inanna literally travels to Eridu and tricks Enki into giving her the me. She loads him onto her boat and sails him back to Uruk, bringing civilization with her. Enki sobers up, realizes what he's done, and tries to stop her. But it's too late. The knowledge is loose. It's a wild story. But hidden inside it is a quiet claim. Civilization is not invented from scratch. It is transferred. And when you look back at the technical side of Sumerian culture, that claim starts to feel less like mythic fluff and more like a blunt statement. Because alongside the myths and hymns, archaeologists found something else among the tablets. Manuals, metallurgical recipes, carefully listing copper-to-tin ratios for bronze. Architectural texts that use geometric proportions for measurements. Medical texts that list symptoms and treatments in structured formats. Agricultural calendars synced to celestial cycles, telling farmers not just when to plant, but when the stars say it's time. These aren't symbolic stories. They're how-to guides. One tablet from the poor, known academically as VAT 4956, or similar designations in other cases, records a synodic cycle of Venus with perfect accuracy, 584 days. That's how long it takes Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun. It's not something you notice with a casual glance upwards. You need long-term data and a system to record and refine it. Other tablets track the movements of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. They calculate lunar phases and predict eclipses. Some even hint at awareness of the precession of equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes almost 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. You don't get that kind of knowledge by accident, especially if you're supposed to be the first civilization just figuring out how to stack bricks. The math we talked about earlier, Plimpton 322 and its Pythagorean triples, fits into the same puzzle. Here's this clay fragment, over 3,000 years old, quietly working with advanced geometry more than 1,000 years before Greek mathematicians made it famous. Not explaining the theorem, just using it. Other tablets demonstrate methods for calculating square roots that look eerily similar to modern iterative algorithms. Some handle problems involving exponential growth, what we now use to model compound interest, population, or radiation. We're so used to thinking of ancient math as basic that we tend to assume these things must be crude approximations. But when researchers actually run the numbers, they often discover the opposite. The calculations are shockingly precise. And then you have the physical artifacts that seem to whisper the same story in metal and clay. Perfectly balanced bronze tools appearing earlier than they should in the official Bronze Age timeline. Cylinder seals that show complex mechanical devices. Pulleys, winches, possibly looms and drills that imply a hands-on understanding of engineering principles like torque and leverage. That strange little composite of clay, copper, and iron we call the Baghdad battery, a possible electrochemical cell built 2,000 years before electricity was discovered. Could these all be isolated cases? Lucky guesses, one-off experiments, misinterpretations? Maybe. Or they might be exactly what they look like. Fragments. Pieces of a bigger system of knowledge that didn't start with Sumer, but survived through it. And the Sumerians had a word for that system. They called it the Me, usually translated as divine decrees or ordinances. The Me are described in the text as fundamental patterns that structure reality, not just laws in a legal sense, but laws in a cosmic sense, codes for everything that exists. Each Me governs an aspect of life. Kingship, priesthood, music, metalworking, writing, wisdom, justice, war, sexuality, decision-making, crafts, even emotional states and social roles. To possess a Me was to hold the blueprint for that thing, not the results, the formula. The myths say the Me originally resided with Enki in the depths of the Abzu, the primeval waters. From there, they could be given or stolen or lost. Knowledge, in other words, was not something humans figured out by trial and error. It was something that existed first in a purer form and then filtered down into human hands and pieces. That's exactly how Sumer looks when you view it through the lens of archaeology and text together. Not a slow climb from ignorance, but culture obsessed with gathering, preserving, and applying pieces of a larger, older code. The deeper you dig, the clearer that pattern becomes. Which brings us to one final mystery. Deeper than the temples, older than the tablets, stranger than the math or the metallurgy. Because if the Me were the code of civilization, then the language they were written in might have been the original operating system. If the Me were the source code of civilization, then Sumerian was the interface, the operating system. And this is where things get really strange. Because out of all the mysteries we've talked about, impossible reign lengths, pre-flood kings, advanced math and astronomy. Nothing is as quietly unsettling as the Sumerian language itself. Not in a poetic way. In a technical way. Sumerian stands alone. Pretty much every other major language we know from the ancient world has a family. Akkadian is Semitic, related to Hebrew and Arabic. Egyptian has its relatives. Indo-European gives us everything from Sanskrit and Greek to Latin and, eventually, English. You can draw family trees, trace shifts and sounds, watch words evolve. But Sumerian? It's an orphan. Linguists have thrown everything at it for over a century. They've tried linking it to Indo-European languages, like Sanskrit or early Iranian dialects. Semitic languages, like Akkadian, Hebrew, or Aramaic. Dravidian languages from southern India. Uralic languages, like Finnish and Hungarian. Even outliers like Basque, another famous isolate. Every time, something breaks. The grammar doesn't line up. The core vocabulary refuses to match. The sound patterns drift off in their own direction. Sumerian doesn't cleanly fit anywhere. In the archaeological record, it doesn't sneak in slowly either. It appears around 3500 BC, already itself, fully equipped. Complex grammar? Check. Rich vocabulary? Check. Writing system capable of handling everything from receipts to literature? Check. There is no baby Sumerian on earlier tablets. No half-formed proto-language we can clearly see. From our perspective, it just arrives. And then, just as strangely, it leaves. By around 2000 BCE, people in Mesopotamia weren't speaking Sumerian anymore in daily life. Akkadian, a Semitic language, had taken over as the spoken tongue. But Sumerian did not simply vanish. Instead, it shifted roles. It became sacred, a liturgical language. For roughly 2,000 years after it stopped being spoken in the streets, priests, scribes, and scholars still learned Sumerian. They copied its texts. They used it in temples, in rituals, in hymns. Akkadian scribes wrote bilingual dictionaries to help translate Sumerian words. Babylonian priests recited Sumerian prayers they probably didn't fully understand anymore, like medieval monks chanting in Latin long after anyone spoke it at home. To them, Sumerian wasn't just an old language. It was the old language, the one you used when you wanted to speak to the gods. Interestingly, the Sumerians themselves never called it Sumerian. That's a modern term. They called their language Imgur, often translated as a noble tongue or the princely language. That's not how you describe something you think you made up. They believe their writing system, the wedge-shaped script we call cuneiform, came from a goddess named Nisaba. She wasn't some floaty muse of poetry. She was a goddess of grain, counting, and knowledge, the patron of scribes, archivists, and mathematicians. Her name literally ties writing to counting, and counting to the stars. In other words, writing wasn't a creative hobby. It was a cosmic responsibility. Cuneiform itself is fascinating. At first glance, it looks like rows of little wedges and lines pressed into clay. But each sign is doing multiple jobs. It can represent a sound like a syllable. It can represent an entire word. It can represent an abstract idea or divine symbol. Which one it means depends entirely on context. Imagine if the letter A could mean the sound A, the word water, or the concept life, depending on where you wrote it. That's the kind of mental flexibility Sumerian scribes trained for. The shapes of the signs weren't random either. Some of the oldest versions of them seem to mirror real-world forms. The sign for mountain looks like peaks. The sign for water resembles flowing waves. The sign for a star radiates outward like light. Over time, those shapes became more abstract, more stylized and geometric, but traces of that original visual logic remain. It's almost like the script started as a direct reflection of the world, then slowly turned into a symbolic code. To write Sumerian was not just to spell words. It was to model reality in clay. Now, here's where the rabbit hole drops another level. In the 1970s, some linguists and musicologists studying Sumerian hymns noticed something odd when they analyzed the structure of the verses. The number of syllables per line, the repetition patterns, the stress beats. They found mathematical ratios hiding inside them. not approximate ones, precise ones. Ratios like 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, the same intervals that define musical consonants, the same harmonic relationships used to tune instruments. Those ratios show up in Sumerian music theory, in their string lengths, in their tuning systems. They show up in their architecture, in the proportions of temples and courtyards. And now, there they were in the language itself, in the rhythm and structure of hymns. It's as if the Sumerian sound, number, and form were all speaking the same underlying grammar. Language, music, and mathematics weren't separate fields. They were just different ways of playing the same code. Some researchers have suggested that this reflects an ancient understanding of reality as vibrational, that the universe is structured by frequencies and harmonics, and that language is humanity's attempt to tune into that structure. Whether or not you buy that interpretation, there's no denying the pattern. Their temples reflect geometric ratios. Their music reflects harmonic ratios. Their hymns reflect those same ratios in syllables and stresses. And underpinning it all is a language they insisted was given, not invented. The word me, those divine codes we've been talking about, doesn't just mean decree or law. It's tied to utterance, to spoken command, to the idea that the gods speak reality into being. The me are not silent rules. They are voice patterns. Later, in other cultures, you get related ideas. The Greek concept of logos, the word, the rational principle structure in the cosmos, the Hebrew idea of the divine word that creates. But Sumer was playing with that theme much earlier. Language is not a random human invention. It's the way you interface with the order of things. From that perspective, Sumerian might not have been just a language. It might have been designed, or at least understood, as a kind of programming system, a syntax for interacting with the structure of reality. And if we follow that line of thought a bit further, something else clicks into place. There's a line in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis, that says, "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech." One language, one shared tongue before the scattering. The story that follows is the Tower of Babel, the attempt to build a structure that reaches heaven, the divine concern that nothing will be impossible for them, and confusion of tongues that forces humanity to scatter. Now, the Sumerians never talk about Babel as such. That's a later name. But they do talk about a great tower in the land of Shinar, Babylonia, and they do talk about a time when gods and humans were not yet divided, when the language of heaven and the language of earth were still aligned. They never say, "We speak Sumerian." They say, "We speak the noble tongue," the language of the gods, the old language. What if that idea of one language wasn't just about grammar or vocabulary? What if it was about a way of speaking that encoded the same harmonic, mathematical, and symbolic relationships across everything? Speech, music, architecture, ritual, a unified code where the way you sang, built, counted, and prayed all use the same underlying ratios. If that's what was lost when tongues were confused, then the tragedy isn't just that people couldn't understand each other's words. It's that they could no longer share a common code for reality. And the Sumerians look like a culture standing very close to that break. By the time they appear in the record, it feels like they're already working with fragments. The language they treat as sacred might itself be a survivor, a partially remembered version of something older, something pre-flood. They cling to it. They copy it. They teach it in temple schools for centuries after it dies in everyday speech. Because on some level, they seem to understand, when this language is forgotten, more than words will be lost. A way of thinking will vanish. A way of encoding reality. A bridge to the age before the flood that no math or monument can fully replace. And as the language fades, the Sumerians do something else. They start building in stone and brick what they can no longer guarantee in sound. They try to reconstruct a bridge not just with words, but with architecture. Massive, layered, stair-step structures that rise out of flat Mesopotamian plain like artificial mountains. They call them Ziggurats. When the language started slipping through their fingers, the Sumerians did what humans always do when words feel too fragile. They turned to stone. Long after flood, long after the old world had been swallowed by water and silence, the people of Mesopotamia tried to rebuild the bridge between heaven and earth. not just through stories or songs, but through architecture. They raised towers, not in a symbolic, this would make a cool myth someday way, but literally massive, stepped structures that rose out of flat plains like artificial mountains. They call them Ziggurats, from the Akkadian Zigguratu, meaning to build high. These weren't smooth pyramids like in Egypt. They were tiered, blocky, layered, giant staircases of mud brick and fired brick, stacked toward the sky. Ur had one. Uruk had one. Eridu, the oldest city, had one. Perched above the same sacred ground that had been rebuilt over and over for thousands of years. But the most famous of them all would rise in Babylon. Its name in Sumerian and Akkadian sources was Anunnaki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. That name alone tells you what it was meant to be. Not just a temple, not just a monument, a connection point. To us, a ziggurat looks like a religious building. To them, it was more like a docking station. Because from the Sumerian point of view, something crucial had been broken by the flood, the link between the world above and the world below. The easy back and forth, the time when knowledge descended from heaven and the Anunnaki walked among people. That was gone. The gods had gone quiet. So humanity built places where that connection could reopen. Each ziggurat was a miniature cosmos. The base represented the earthly realm, solid, square, aligned carefully with the cardinal directions. As you went up, each level symbolized a higher layer of heaven. Some traditions say each tier was painted a different color to match the visible planets. Black for Saturn, white for Jupiter, red for Mars, gold for the Sun, and so on. Climb the structure, and you weren't just going higher physically. You were symbolically ascending to the levels of the universe. At the top, there was usually a small temple or chamber, simple but significant, a bed, a table, offerings of food and drink, an open view of the sky. And here's the key detail. Those rooms weren't built for priests. They were prepared for gods. Ziggurats weren't meant to be ladders we use to get up to heaven. They were meant to be platforms for heaven to come down. The rituals reflect that. Ordinary people didn't get to climb all the way up. Only trained priests and priestesses, those who knew the old hymns and formulas, ascended the staircases, carrying offerings, chanting the ancient tongue, performing ceremonies designed to invite descent. The structure itself, its orientation, proportions, colors, was part of the ritual, part of the signal. If language had once encoded the cosmic code, now architecture was trying to do the same thing in brick. In Babylon, Anunnaki was the grandest attempt. According to later descriptions, it rose about 7 stories high, nearly 90 meters, or close to 300 feet. In a flat landscape, that's enormous. You could see it from miles away. The Greek historian Herodotus visited Babylon centuries later and wrote about a gigantic tower built in stages, with a shrine at the top containing a great couch and a golden table. The priests told him their chief god would descend to rest there. By Herodotus' time, though, the rituals were already faint echoes. He was seeing a reenactment of something that had been much more alive in earlier ages. And somewhere along the way, this towering structure, this house of the foundation of heaven and earth, gave birth to a story you probably know, the Tower of Babel. In the version preserved in the Hebrew Bible, humanity is united, speaking one language. They settle on the plain of Shinar, another name for the Mesopotamian lowlands, and decide to build a tower with its top in the heavens. God comes down, sees what they're building, and says, essentially, if they can do this while speaking one language, nothing they plan will be impossible for them. So their language is confounded. They stop understanding each other. The project collapses. Humanity scatters. The tower is abandoned. The story is usually taught as a warning about pride, a lesson against overreaching. But that's not how the Mesopotamians themselves seem to have seen it. From their perspective, the problem wasn't that humans wanted to climb up and dethrone the gods. They weren't storming heaven with ladders. They were trying to reopen a connection that had been lost. To them, the ziggurat wasn't an act of arrogant rebellion. It was an act of grief, of longing. They knew that once, in a time remembered dimly in their myths, the barrier between heaven and earth had been thinner. The gods had walked in gardens, spoken with kings, given direct instructions. Knowledge descended freely. Then the flood came. The world was reset. The gods withdrew. The Ziggurats were invitations. Here, they seemed to say, we've built a place where you can return. We've aligned it to the stars. We've sung the old hymns in the old language. We prepared a bed, a table, offerings. Please come back. From that angle, the confusion of tongues hits differently. It's not just a punishment. It's the final cut. If Sumerian, or something like it, was the last surviving echo of a pre-flood, unified language, then the scattering of tongues would mean more than just miscommunication at a construction site. It would mean the collapse of shared code. A language that once aligned speech, music, mathematics, and architecture under the same set of ratios and symbols gets splintered into hundreds of local systems that don't line up neatly anymore. After that, you can still build towers. You can still raise temples. But you've lost a harmonized grammar that supposedly once resonated with the structure of reality itself. You don't just lose fluency with the gods. You lose fluency with the world. Folklore remembers Babel as the moment humans were humbled. Mesopotamian memory, if you read between the lines, remembers it as the moment humans were cut off. The Ziggurats remained. Priests still climbed them. Rituals were still performed. Offerings were still laid out in empty rooms at the top. Hymns were still chanted in a language that fewer and fewer people truly understood. But the age when those who from heaven to earth came walked openly among humans, that was over. Ziggurats turned from bridges into monuments, not testimonies to success, but to absence, stairways leading into a silence that no longer answered. And while all of this was unfolding, while languages fractured, while towers rose and eroded, a slow shift was taking place. The lived memory of the pre-flood world faded into legend. Legend faded into myth. Myth was eventually recategorized by us as fiction. History, as we define it, begins where that connection ends. We draw the line of real at precisely the point where the Sumerians say something enormous was lost. So today, when we look back at Ziggurats, we see ruins, brick platforms, tourist sites, but from above, from orbit, from satellite imagery, you can trace something else. You see the ghosts of those towers embedded in the wider landscape of Mesopotamia, surrounded by the faint outlines of walls, streets, canals, and temples. The land looks like a palimpsest, a page written on, scraped clean, and written on again. Beneath that, older cities. Beneath those, flood silt. Beneath that, burned settlements. And beneath all of it, according to the Sumerian tablets, the memory of a world that came before. A world they insisted they did not create, only restore. From far above, from the quiet eye of a satellite, Mesopotamia looks like a palimpsest. Layers upon layers of human effort pressed into the land. Faint outlines of ancient canals. Ghostly city walls. Mounds where temples once scraped the sky. A desert that's not empty at all, just written over too many times. On the ground, those layers are harder to see. The ruins of Uruk barely push above the sand. Eridu lies mostly under tarp and dust, as if it's still trying to stay buried. The ziggurat at UR has been partially restored, its steps catching moonlight like a fossilized staircase to nowhere. And then there are the tablets. In museums around the world, Berlin, London, Baghdad, Istanbul, Paris, the clay rests behind glass. Thousands of tablets. Tens of thousands. Maybe hundreds of thousands if we count the ones still in archives, uncatalogued. They're small, most of them. You could fit many in the palm of your hand. They don't look like much. Brown, cracked, quiet, but on their surfaces, those wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform, are still sharp, still legible, still whispering in a language no one speaks anymore. And somewhere in the silence between those marks, in the gaps between what was written and what was lost, a question hangs in the air. What world existed before the flood? Because if you follow the anomalies, the impossible king reigns, the sudden appearance of advanced mathematics, the fully formed language, the planetary cycles, the geometrically precise cities, they all seem to be pointing backwards, not toward the birth of civilization, but toward the fading echo of an older one. The Sumerians themselves said as much, over and over, on cylinder seals, on dedicatory inscriptions. in their temple records, they called what they were doing restoration. This is the restoration of what was before. They didn't claim to invent the layout of sacred cities. They didn't brag about creating writing from nothing. They didn't say, we discovered math. They said kingship descended. Writing was given. The me were transferred. Their language shows up fully formed with no obvious ancestors. Their mathematics arrived complete, with ratios and formulas that would vanish and then be rediscovered much later in Greece, India, and Europe. Their astronomy tracks cycles that demand generations of observation. Yet Sumer stands at the supposed beginning of literate time. Their cities rise with alignments and proportions that feel less like trial and error and more like someone is following a plan. It's like walking into a workshop after a disaster and finding someone carefully piecing together blueprints scattered across the floor. And if we stop insisting that all of this has to be just myth with numbers and instead read their records as testimony, as a traumatized culture trying to be honest about its own origins, then the picture shifts. What we've been calling the dawn of civilization starts to look more like twilight. The flood, in that case, isn't the dramatic finale of a morality tale. It's the halfway mark, the divider between a world that had already developed an entire system of knowledge and a world trying desperately to salvage pieces of it. For a long time, historians shrugged this off. Of course they told stories like that. Everyone wants to believe they're descended from something more glorious. But then geology, archaeology, and climate science started quietly chiming in from the background. Across Mesopotamia, we've already talked about those flood layers, a sudden band of sterile, water-laid clay separating older burned cities from newer rebuilds. But the pattern doesn't stop there. Cores pulled from the black sea show a dramatic change around 7,500 years ago. Freshwater sediments suddenly give way to saltwater deposits, suggesting that what had been a smaller freshwater lake was abruptly flooded by an influx of Mediterranean seawater when natural land barriers failed. For the people living on those shores, it would have felt like the sea itself invading the land. Villages drowned in weeks. Fields turned to seafloor. Whatever culture lived on that ancient coastline, its towns, its shrines, its stories, was erased or forced to run. Turn the clock further back, to the end of the last ice age. Between about 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, the planet's climate lashed back and forth. Ice sheets melted. Massive glacial lakes suddenly burst their natural dams in catastrophic floods. Sea levels rose, not in gentle, predictable inches, but in jolts. The global sea stood over 100 meters, more than 300 feet, lower during the peak of the Ice Age. That means coastlines we know today were underwater back then and vice versa. Entire habitable regions that once existed along ancient shorelines are now drowned. If human beings were living in those coastal zones, and there's every reason to think they would have watched the ocean march inland, eating their world. You don't just forget that. You pass it down. Not as a dry geological report, but as a story that defines your people. There was a world before. The waters rose. We lost almost everything. You tell it next to campfires. You carve hints of it into stone. You encode it in ritual. You wrap it in gods and metaphors, because that's how memory survives when you don't have hard drives and cloud backups. Now, take that idea and zoom out across the planet. Off the coast of India, there are submerged structures near places like Dwarka and the Gulf of Kambat. Stone alignments and what look like man-made features sitting under tens of meters of water. Their exact interpretation is controversial, but the possibility is there. Ancient habitation zones now drowned. Off Japan's Yonaguni coast. Strange terrace formations, natural, modified, both? Hint at human activity in areas long since claimed by the sea. In the Mediterranean, divers have found what appear to be ancient harbors and stone structures now far below modern sea level. Then there's Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, 11,000 to 12,000 years old, older than agriculture as we usually define it, built by people who were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers. Yet somehow, there they are, carving multi-ton stones, arranging them in circles, decorating them with sophisticated symbolic art. For a long time, Göbekli Tepe looked like an out-of-place anomaly. Now, in the context of everything else, it might be something else entirely. not the first spark of civilization, one of the last monuments of a world that already understood more than we think. Imagine that, a global patchwork of early cultures along Ice Age coastlines, trading, building, watching the sky, gradually or suddenly submerged as the world warmed and the oceans rose. The survivors flee inland. They carry seeds, tools, artifacts, and, most importantly, fragments of knowledge. Some of them end up in the Fertile Crescent, in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates. Their descendants, countless generations later, become the people we call Sumerians. Is that proven? No. It's a model, a possibility. But it's a model that fits uncomfortably well with what the Sumerians themselves said. We are restoring what came before. Their cities, their math, their astronomy, their language, the way it appears fully formed and then lingers as a liturgical fossil, the way they obsessively copy king lists, flood stories, hymns to the goddess of writing. It all looks like the behavior of a culture that knows what it means to lose everything. They lived in the shadow of a great forgetting. The flood wasn't just a story in their past. It was a trauma baked into their identity. They were the children of survivors, the keepers of fragments, the scribes of a drowned world. And somehow, across thousands of years and countless layers of dust, they succeeded in getting that message to us. We read their tablets. We dig up their cities. We notice their star charts match ours. We realize their number system is still ticking away in every clock and every compass degree. We see their flood in our geology. We recognize their trauma in our myths. And right at the heart of it, pressed into clay and left for whoever came next, is the same quiet warning. Civilization is not guaranteed. Knowledge is not permanent. Every age believes it is the beginning, but more often than not, it's someone else's after. We like to imagine we're different. We have satellites, quantum computers, particle accelerators, a nervous system of glass fiber, and radio waves wrapped around the planet. Sumer had clay, so it's easy to look back 5,000 years and think, of course they thought that. They didn't know what we know. They didn't have what we have. But if you strip away the aesthetics, mud bricks versus skyscrapers, reed stylus versus touchscreen, the pattern doesn't really change. Civilizations rise. They accumulate knowledge. They build monuments. Physical ones, digital ones, ideological ones. They encode their wisdom into systems they're sure will outlast them. And then, through war, catastrophe, or just a slow gnawing of time, those systems fail. The knowledge doesn't vanish completely. Humanity doesn't get reset to zero like a video game. But enough is lost that the next culture down the line has to start over from the fragments. They find ruins, artifacts, inscriptions. Maybe they remember some of the stories. Maybe not. They reverse engineer what they can. And what they call progress is, in many ways, just a very determined act of remembering. The Sumerians were painfully aware of this. The flood wasn't ancient history to them. It was living memory. Not in the sense of someone's grandfather literally surviving it, but in the sense that trauma echoes across generations. They grew up in a world built on top of silt that had buried an older world. They told stories about a time when the gods walked among humans, when knowledge came down from the sky, when kings ruled for spans of time measured not in lifetimes, but in cosmic cycles. And they knew, deep down, that all of that could be lost again. So they wrote, obsessively. They copied and recopied the king list, even when the numbers no longer made sense. They preserved the flood story in multiple versions. They sang hymns to Nasaba, the goddess of writing and counting, as if they knew their tablets were their only real lifeline into the future. They built Ziggurats as if the gods might still come back. They kept the dead language alive for 2,000 years because it was tied, in their minds, to the age before the waters came. They wrote down star charts, legal codes, medical recipes, mathematical formulas, contracts about contracts. They recorded themselves to an almost comical degree. And 5 millennia later, here we are. Their cities are buried but excavated. Their language died, but we've deciphered it. Their star charts line up with our telescopes. Their base, 60 mass, still structures our clocks and compasses. Their flood story echoes in distorted form in religions and myths across the planet. They preserve the memory. But tucked inside that success is a warning. Every age eventually forgets, and we are not magically exempt. We like to think our knowledge is secure because it's everywhere, in the cloud, on drives, on servers, mirrored, backed up, distributed. But all of it depends on layers of infrastructure that are astonishingly fragile. Electric grids, global supply chains, rare earth mining, specialized chip fabrication, network backbones, stable climates, political cooperation. Start pulling enough of those threads, and the whole web starts to shake. Ask yourself a slightly uncomfortable question. If tomorrow every data center on Earth went dark, if every hard drive corrupted, if the power grid collapsed and didn't come back for 100 years, what would we leave behind that someone, thousands of years from now, could actually read? Think about how much of our world is locked behind passwords, proprietary file formats, encryption keys, server-side logic. Think about how long a USB drive lasts in harsh conditions, or a Blu-ray disc, or a laptop battery. Now compare that to a clay tablet dried in the sun and forgotten in the corner of a ruined house. No electricity, no special hardware, just a person with eyes, patience, and eventually a Rosetta Stone moment where one bilingual inscription unlocks the code. Clay is slow, awkward, heavy. It doesn't hold videos or high-res images, but it can survive fire, flood, empire, and neglect. Our own tablets are fast, brilliant, capable of storing libraries inside a slab of glass and silicon. But if no one keeps feeding power into them, no one maintains the infrastructure behind them, they become inert rocks with dead circuits. Standing in a museum, looking at Sumerian tablets behind glass, it's tempting to smile at their simplicity. But there's another way to see it. Maybe clay wasn't primitive. Maybe clay was wise. Maybe in some ways, they chose a better long-term backup. The Sumerians weren't dumb farmers fumbling into civilization by accident. They were survivors of something huge, something we're only just beginning to piece together from our own science. And their message, baked into thousands of little clay rectangles, is incredibly consistent. We had something. We lost almost all of it. We are trying to restore what we can. Remember that what you build can be taken. Remember that knowledge is not permanent. Remember that every flood, whether it's literal water or war or famine or technological collapse, or just the slow sanding down of time, resets more than buildings. It resets memory. Only those who have written something durable into the bones of the world get the chance to rebuild from more than scratch. The Sumerians encoded their world in mud and stone. We encode ours in electricity and code. The next flood might not look like a wall of water. It might be climate collapse that redraws maps and shatters systems. It might be nuclear war or a string of smaller wars that grind infrastructure into dust. It might be something slower and stranger, a kind of civilizational burnout, where systems become so complex and so dependent on tiny, fragile components that eventually nobody remembers how to fix them when they break. Whatever form it takes, the pattern is the same. Things fall apart, and someone someday is left to sift through the ruins. The question is, what will they find when they dig to the layers of us? Picture this. It's thousands of years from now. Our cities are gone, eroded, overgrown, or buried. Maybe our coastlines have shifted. Maybe the deserts have expanded. Maybe the ice sheets grew back or vanished completely. A group of future archaeologists, whoever they are, stands in the ruins of what used to be our world. They find twisted metal, broken concrete, plastic turned brittle under alien sunlight. They find glass, silicon, strange layer composites. They find hints of how far we got. Satellite dishes, turbine blades, the skeletons of skyscrapers, maybe even the corroded bones of a rocket half buried in dust. They might also find a few lucky survivors of our records, etch plates, archival paper, maybe a stone monument or two with names carved in languages they don't know. If they're very lucky, they'll find some digital storage that hasn't been completely destroyed. Hard drive, memory cards, a buried server rack in a cooled, sealed space. But even then, they'd have a problem. Our knowledge isn't just in the physical objects. It's in the systems that interpret them. The codex, file formats, operating systems, encryption standards. Without the right software, the right hardware, the right layer cake of compatibility, even a perfectly preserved hard drive is just a black box. It's like handing a Sumerian scribe a Blu-ray disc and saying, "Everything we know is in here." He'd turn it over, hold it up to the light, maybe wear it as jewelry, but he wouldn't be able to read a thing. And suddenly, we're not that different from him, are we? We stand in climate-controlled rooms, staring at tablets from UR and the poor in Uruk. We spent decades, centuries, decoding their marks, matching the same sign across hundreds of tablets until patterns emerge. Using multilingual inscriptions like the Behistan and translations of Akkadian and other languages to slowly unlock Sumerian, we've worked hard to recover maybe a fraction of what they tried to preserve. And even now, our translations are approximations, reconstructions, best guesses based on shards. This is a part that loops back, quietly, to the beginning of our story. The Sumerians called themselves restorers. They built their cities on top of older foundations. They rebuilt temples on the exact same sacred spots. They aligned their streets with patterns they said came from heaven. They told us, repeatedly, that they were bringing back what had existed before the flood. We look at them and say, "Ah, yes, the first civilization." But if they could stand in a museum with us, in front of their own tablets, they might laugh. First, they'd say, "No, we were the ones trying not to forget." And here we are, 5,000 years later, doing the same thing with them. We dig, we decipher, we reconstruct. We take their fragments and try to rebuild their world in our minds. It should make us pause. Because if civilization really works in cycles, build, flourish, collapse, rebuild, then we're not the opening chapter of some grand, linear story. We might be somewhere near the middle, or the end of a chapter, or the beginning of a recovery we don't even realize is a recovery. We take for granted that we're the most advanced humans have ever been. And in some ways, sure, that's probably true. Our technology is wild. Our reach is global. We can see galaxies and smash atoms and map genomes. But if an earlier civilization existed, limited in number, located along ancient coastlines now under hundreds of feet of water, scattered by ice age floods or other catastrophes, it could have left behind different kinds of sophistication. Not necessarily smartphones and satellites, but things we haven't even thought to look for. We might be staring straight at some of their remnants, megalithic structures, drowned ruins, myths that sound too persistent to be pure coincidence, and calling them ritual or symbolic, because we don't have a user manual. The Sumerians look like people who did have a worn, partial copy of that manual. Not the original, not the whole thing, but enough. Enough to know they were latecomers in a longer story. Enough to remember that something older had risen and fallen before them. Enough to know that the flood wasn't just an act of punishment, but an act of erasure. Knowledge is harder to kill than people, but not impossible. Burn enough libraries. Break enough transmission chains. Let enough languages die without being written down. You don't erase humans' ability to think. You erase the scaffolding that lets each generation stand on the shoulders of the last. The Sumerians fought that erosion tooth and nail. They understood that what makes a civilization fragile isn't just its buildings, it's its continuity, its ability to remember what it has already learned. And that's where things loop back to us in a way that's a little uncomfortable. Because if you zoom in on our world right now, you start to see cracks in our continuity. 2. Our systems are complex. So complex that no single person really understands them from top to bottom. The microchips in your phone rely on rare minerals mined in one continent, processed in another, built into components in a third, assembled in a fourth, shipped through oceans and ports maintained by entire invisible ecosystems of logistics, politics, and infrastructure. Our knowledge is specialized and scattered. That's our strength and our vulnerability. If something big enough shakes the system, whether climate chaos, global conflict, or cascading technological failure, we might survive as a species. We're resilient cockroaches when we have to be. But what about our memory? How much of our science, our art, our history, our understanding of the universe, is actually secured in forms that can ride out 1,000 or 5,000 years of chaos. How much of it will future diggers be able to reconstruct from whatever we leave embedded in rock, metal, glass, or whatever long-lived material we've used? Millions of books, if protected, might endure a while. Inscribed stone will last even longer. But most of our cutting-edge stuff, the simulations, models, code bases, research locked behind paywalls and logins, the context that makes sense of numbers, that's as fragile as a power grid. This isn't about fear-mongering. It's about perspective. The Sumerians didn't know our world, but they understood something about the flow of history that we tend to forget. Civilization's biggest threat isn't just external disaster. It's amnesia. The flood in their story didn't just drown people. It drowned context. It swept away the continuity that tied them to the pre-flood kings and the Anunnaki and the age when the gods walked openly. What survived had to be rescued deliberately, pressed into clay, etched into stone, retold in story after story after story until it calcified into myth. Myth is what memory turns into when it loses its documentation. From inside the story, it's testimony. From outside, it looks like legend. So here's the really unsettling thought. What if some of our myths about the Sumerians are actually their myths about the people before them? What if we're holding a copy of a copy, blurry around the edges, but still carrying enough signal to tell us, you are not the first to get this far. You are not the first to lose almost everything. And you will not be the last to stand here, wondering how the ones before you knew so much. If that's true, then the question shifts. It's no longer just, were the Sumerians the first civilization? It becomes, what exactly did they manage to save? And what did they lose that we'll never even know existed? And then, inevitably, what are we willing to lose? Because whether the next flood is water, war, or some glitch in the very systems we depend on, one thing is guaranteed. Something will come. Something always does. The Sumerians would probably tell us that the flood is always coming. Not always as water. Sometimes as fire. Sometimes as famine. Sometimes as a slowly thinning memory that no one notices until it's almost gone. From their point of view, the catastrophe that reset their world wasn't just a meteorological event. It was a break in transmission. The pre-flood kings, the Anunnaki, the age of long reigns and descending knowledge, that wasn't just about supernatural beings and impossible timelines. It was about continuity, about a world where wisdom was handed down in a relatively unbroken chain. Then the chain snapped. The survivors weren't blank slates. They weren't primitive cavemen, suddenly blinking awake into consciousness. They were traumatized humans clutching fragments of a system that had taken ages to build. When the flood receded, they did what we would do. They tried to rebuild. But they weren't starting from a clean developer environment. They were starting from corrupted files, half-remembered procedures, tools whose original purposes had been forgotten, stories whose details were blurring into symbolism. So they worked with what they had. They built cities following patterns that felt right, because they echoed something older. They aligned temples with stars, because that's how it had always been done, even if few remembered why. They wrote in a language they treated like a holy artifact, even as it slowly drifted out of everyday speech. They walked among ruins that, to them, might already have seemed impossibly ancient. And at some point, they made a choice. If we can't keep everything, we will keep something. We will keep the star charts. We will keep the flood story. We will keep the king list. We will keep the language of the gods alive, at least in our temples. We will encode our reality into clay and stone and trust that someone, someday, will find it. That's what those tablets are. Not just data. Not just bureaucracy. Not just religious propaganda. They're a bet, a wager on the future. Some unknown scribe in Nippur or Uruk or Eridu sat there day after day scratching wedges into wet clay, probably not thinking about you specifically, but absolutely thinking about someone. Someone on the other side of chaos. Someone who would inherit their world the way they inherited the world before them. In ruins and fragments, with more questions than answers. So they wrote, and wrote, and wrote. They knew they lived in a world that had already ended once. They'd grown up in the shadow of that ending. They breathed it in with their myths and rituals. We live in a world that feels like it's ending for different reasons. The headlines scream about climate tipping points, mass extinctions, political instability, global systems stressed to breaking. But underneath the noise, the Sumerian pattern is still there. We've built a towering civilization, in some ways more intricate than anything before. But its complexity is a kind of height. A ziggurat made of dependencies. At the base, basic survival. Food, water, shelter. Above that, infrastructure. Power, roads, supply chains, agriculture scaled to billions. Above that, technology. Communications, medicine, machines. Above that, metasystems. Finance, law, global coordination, virtual spaces. At the summit, the very abstract things we're most proud of, our models of the universe, our deep theories, our art, our philosophy, our vast, elaborate archives of knowledge. When something shakes the base, the top trembles. When enough of the middle steps crack, the peak is useless. What the Sumerians understood is that when the tower falls, you don't just rebuild the top. You can't. You don't have the scaffolding anymore. You start at the ground with what you remember, which is why their decision to carve memory into clay wasn't just piety. It was strategy. They weren't preserving stories for themselves. They already knew the stories. They were preserving them for whoever came after the next flood. We're doing something similar every time we write, record, upload, or store. But we've outsourced faith and durability to our technology. We assume the servers will always be maintained. We assume the organizations hosting our data will always exist. We assume future generations will be able to read what we write. Because why wouldn't they? The Sumerians had no such illusions. They watched entire cities vanish under layers of silt. They saw their own sky-blackening storms. They were intimately familiar with the idea that everything can disappear, so they made their backups of mud. Not glamorous, but effective. Clay tablets survived the burning of libraries, the collapse of empires, the looting of palaces, the grinding jaws of time. They outlived kings, dynasties, religions, and languages. They lay there, anonymous, waiting, while we went through our own cycles of rise and fall. And when we were finally ready, when we developed philology and archaeology and a global academic community and enough stability to slow down and listen, we dug them up, cleaned them, and taught ourselves to read them. We completed the loop they started. So the real question isn't were the Sumerians the first civilization? It's, what did they want us to know? Strip away the layers of interpretation. The debates about aliens versus metaphors, the academic arguments about translation, and a few core messages keep coming through. Civilization is not guaranteed. There was a world before ours. It was real enough to be remembered, but fragile enough to drown. Knowledge can be lost on a massive scale. Whole systems of science, language, and order can vanish in a few generations. Myth is sometimes memory wearing a mask. Flood stories, god kings, heavenly teachers. These may be distorted reflections of real events and real people seen to the fog of time and trauma. Restoration is as important as invention. The Sumerians weren't just creators. They were documenters, archivists, renovators of a broken past. If you don't actively preserve, you will forget. And once you forget, rebuilding takes far longer than you think. Those messages aren't just about them. They're about us. Right now, we are the equivalent of Sumer in someone else's future myth. The ones who knew so much and somehow let it slip away. Or the ones who didn't. Because we're not powerless in this story. We can choose to act like our knowledge matters beyond the next product cycle, the next election, the next news cycle. We can choose to think in terms of civilizational backups, not just personal convenience. Some people are already doing this, designing time-proof archives etched into sapphire disks, storing human genomes in cold, remote facilities, building seed banks in the Arctic, sending data into space on gold-plated records. It sounds grandiose, almost sci-fi, but at its core it's the same impulse that drove a Sumerian scribe to press a reed into clay. Let this survive me. Let this carry something of what we learn into a time I will never see. The Sumerians had no guarantee anyone would ever read their work. For most of those tablets, no one did for thousands of years. But they wrote anyway. Because they understood that when the next flood comes, whatever form it takes, the only thing that crosses that water intact is what you've managed to anchor in something stronger than habit and assumption. In the end, it may not matter whether the Anunnaki were literal beings, mythologized ancestors, or symbols for a lost world's teachers. It may not matter whether the pre-flood kings ruled for 36,000 actual years, or whether those numbers encode celestial cycles we barely understand. What matters is that the Sumerians saw themselves as standing at the edge of an enormous forgetting, and they refused to let it finish its work. They pressed back against oblivion with the tools they had. Clay, geometry, language, ritual. We have more tools, more reach, more data, more capacity to build ziggurats of knowledge that might outlast our own floods. But that will only happen if we think like they did, not just as consumers of the present, but as ancestors, as restorers, as scribes of a world that, one day, will also be dust under someone else's feet. Someone who might pick up a fragment of us, brush it off, and ask the same question we asked the Sumer. What were they trying so hard to remember? So, let's go back to where we started, to the desert, to southern Iraq, where the horizon wavers in heat and the wind nudges sand across foundations that were old when most of our myths were unborn. If you were standing there right now, on the edge of what used to be Uruk or Eridu, you might not see much at first. Just low mounds, broken bricks, scraps of pottery. A few reconstructed steps leading up the side of a ziggurat the sky has long since forgotten. It doesn't look like the birthplace of civilization, but maybe that's the point. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's one of the last places where a shattered civilization tried to save what it could. A Sumerian scribe, sitting in the shade of a mud brick wall, reads stylus in hand, pressing tiny wedge marks into wet clay. He's not thinking about being ancient. He's thinking about his job. Record the grain. Record the wages. Record the hymn. Record the star positions. Record the kings and their reigns. He doesn't know that 5,000 years later, someone will read his work under museum lights and get chills. He doesn't know we'll argue about him in universities, or that some of us will make YouTube videos about his world at 3 in the morning. He probably feels like he's living in the middle of things, not at the beginning. That's the trick of history. Everyone thinks they're in the middle. The Sumerians were in the middle of their story, looking backward at a world destroyed by flood and forward into a future they knew could bring another one. We're in the middle of ours, looking backward at them with curiosity and a little arrogance, and forward at whatever comes next with a mix of fear and denial. But if you strip away the costume, the reeds, the bricks, the tablets, they were doing what we're doing, trying not to forget, trying to buy time against the next reset. They carved into their reality the idea that what we call progress might just be the recovery of knowledge that was already here once, in some other form. They insisted that their wisdom was inherited, not discovered, that their language was given, not invented, that their cities were restorations, not prototypes. That's a humbling thought. We like being pioneers, firsts, innovators, the cutting edge of a straight, upward line. But what if we're also restorers, like them? What are some of the things we're most proud of? Our math, our astronomy, even our sense that language is somehow woven into the fabric of reality. Our less brand new leaps and more remembering? Maybe not one-to-one, not copies. We don't need Atlantis with Wi-Fi for this to be true, but echoes, patterns. We figured out base 60 math again because it really is useful for certain things. We mapped the sky again because the sky is always there. We pointed telescopes at Venus and wrote down the same 584-day cycle that a tired Sumerian scribe once scratched into clay by lantern light. We built our own towers, skyscrapers, satellites, undersea cables, orbital stations, because humans like reaching upward. We built our own ziggurats of code and circuitry that link ground and sky in ways the Sumerians would have called magic. And now, we're at a point where our decisions ripple across the entire planet faster than any myth ever spread. That's incredible and terrifying. The Sumerians believed kingship descended from heaven, that true authority came from alignment with cosmic order. If a ruler forgot that, disaster followed. We don't think in those terms anymore, but we still live under laws we didn't write. Physics, biology, ecology, cause and effect. Ignore those long enough, and reality pushes back. Climate, resources, systems stretch past their breaking points. The Sumerian flood was, in their telling, a reaction to imbalance. The world had become too loud, too chaotic, too out of tune. The remedy was brutal. Wipe the slate, keep a seed, start again. We don't need a literal global flood for the same pattern to play out. Collapse is what happens when a system refuses to change until it's forced to. And then the survivors, whoever they are, walk among our ruins and try to remember us. They'll find our equivalent of cuneiform, whatever we manage to leave in a form they can decode. Maybe it's etched sapphire. Maybe it's metal plates buried in salt mines. Maybe it's stone monuments barely hanging on. Maybe it's fragments of this video, compressed and forgotten in some data bunker that outlived the company that built it. And they'll ask the same questions we asked about Sumer. How did they know what they knew? Why did they lose so much? What were they trying to tell the future? If we're lucky, if we're deliberate, maybe they'll find more than just our confusion and our mistakes. Maybe they'll find warnings. Maybe they'll find blueprints. Maybe they'll find proof that we knew the house was on fire and tried, however clumsily, to pass them the fire extinguisher. That is, in a strange way, the gift the Sumerians gave us. Not answers. Perspective. They remind us that we are not guaranteed a smooth, upward climb, that the line of human civilization is jagged, interrupted, full of breaks that look a lot like endings until someone chooses to start writing again. They remind us that what feels like myth from the outside might be lived memory from the inside. They remind us that a single sentence, then the flood swept over, can hide 1,000 unrecorded heartbreaks. And they remind us that the things we do today, the way we document, store, and share what we know, might matter to people we will never meet as much as Sumerian clay matters to us. So what do we do with that? On a personal level, maybe it starts with something small. Treat knowledge like a trust, not a possession. Write things down in ways that can outlive platforms and trends. Support the kind of work, archives, long-term projects, open access information. That doesn't feel urgent now, but will be priceless when everything else has moved on or burn out. Think of yourself not just as a consumer of the present, but as an ancestor. On a bigger scale, maybe it means thinking like the Sumerian restorers instead of assuming with a first and last word on everything. Ask, what are we breaking that we can't easily rebuild? What are we forgetting that we'll wish we'd remembered? What would we want someone 5,000 years from now to know about us? Not the polished mythology, not the PR. The truth, that we saw the cracks, that we felt the water rising, that we argued and denied and delayed, but also that some of us tried to warn, tried to adapt, tried to preserve what mattered, tried to send a message forward through whatever flood is coming. The Sumerians pressed their message into clay and left it under the sand. Ours might be etched into crystal, embedded in satellites, buried deep underground, or scattered across whatever infrastructure survives us. Either way, the question is the same. When the next civilization bends over our remains and brushes dust off our artifacts, what story will they hear us telling? One of hubris and waste, or one of hard-won remembrance? As the desert wind moves over a rock tonight, it carries dust that was once walls and doorways and temple steps. Somewhere under that dust, more tablets are still buried. More lines we haven't read yet, more fragment of a world trying to speak to us across time. And just like them, we are writing now into a future we can't see. Every story we tell, every record we leave, every act of preservation is a tiny wedge mark in wet clay. A quiet way of saying, to whoever comes after, we were here, we knew some things, we lost some things, we tried to remember, and maybe, just maybe, what looks like our beginning is only the restoration of what was before.